The morning sun had barely poked through the curtains when I heard the familiar hum of a car engine outside. I jolted awake, my heart racing. It was too early for anyone to be there. I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. A black limousine was parked in the driveway, and a man in a dark suit was getting out. My mind scrambled for answers. Was this a mistake? Who could be here so early? I tiptoed to the door and listened. The house was still quiet, except for the soft snores coming from Lovey's room. I took a deep breath and opened the door a crack. The man in the suit was walking up the path, a folder in his hand. He looked official, like someone from the government or a lawyer. My heart pounded in my chest. What could he want? I quickly closed the door and pressed my back against it. What should I do? Should I wake Lovey? But what if this was something bad? I couldn't bear to see her upset. I decided to wait and see what he wanted. Maybe it was just a routine visit. I tiptoed to the kitchen, hoping to find something to calm my nerves. Lovey had already beaten me to it. The coffee pot was steaming, and the aroma filled the air. She had that worried look on her face, the one she gets when she's trying to hide something. "June, you're up early," she said without turning around. "Did you hear the car?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Yeah, I heard it. Do you know who it is?" Lovey hesitated, her hands trembling as she poured the coffee. "I think it might be someone from Elvis's management. They said they needed to talk to us about something important." My stomach churned. Important. What could be so important that they had to show up at dawn? I tried to steady my breathing. "Do you think it's about Elvis?" Lovey sighed, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know, June, but whatever it is, we'll face it together." The doorbell rang and we both jumped. Lovey took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. "Stay here, I'll handle it." I watched her go, my heart aching with a mix of fear and curiosity. What could this be about? Was Elvis in trouble? Was he hurt? My mind raced with the worst scenarios, each one more terrifying than the last. Lovey opened the door, and the man in the suit walked in. He looked at her with a somber expression, and handed her the folder. "Mrs. Presley, I'm here to deliver a message from Colonel Parker. It's about Elvis." Lovey's face went pale, and she clutched the folder like it was a lifeline. "Please come in," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't stay in the kitchen any longer. I had to know what was happening. I followed them into the living room, where the man sat down and opened the folder. Lovey looked at me, her eyes pleading for me to stay strong. "Mrs. Presley, June, I have some difficult news to share." The man began, his voice low and serious. "Elvis has been called up for military service. He's been drafted, and he'll be leaving for basic training in a few weeks." The words hit me like a punch in the gut. Drafted, military service. It felt like the world had stopped spinning. Lovey's hands were shaking, and I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. "Is this for real?" I managed to ask, my voice cracking. "Is there nothing we can do?" The man shook his head. "I'm afraid not. The draft is mandatory, and there's no way to avoid it. Colonel Parker wanted you to know as soon as possible, so you can prepare." Lovey sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. I felt a wave of helplessness wash over me. Elvis was going to be sent away, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. The thought of him in uniform, far away from home, made my heart ache. The man gave Lovey a sympathetic look. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Lovey looked up, her eyes red and puffy. "Thank you, but I think we need some time to process this. Please, just give us a moment." The man nodded and stood up. "Of course. I'll be in the car if you need anything." As soon as he left, Lovey broke down, her sobs echoing through the room. I sat down next to her, not knowing what to say. "It's going to be okay, Lovey. We'll figure this out." But even as I said the words, I knew they were hollow. How could anything be okay when Elvis was being taken away? The future seemed uncertain and dark, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change forever. We got inside the huge train station, and it was super crowded. I didn't know which way to go. Suddenly, Red West and Gene Smith appeared out of nowhere. Red took my hand and Gene took Pat's. We pushed and shoved our way through the people and back into the railroad yard, where there were rows and rows of trains. We stepped over track after track and turned between two trains. About 10 cars down, I saw Elvis leaning out, looking for us. My heart skipped a beat when he jumped down from the train and ran to meet us. My heart wanted to run, but my feet kept walking calmly in his direction. He scooped me up, gave me a quick kiss, and put me back down. Grabbing my hand, we ran to a different train. He climbed aboard and pulled me up the high steps right into his arms. He carried me to his private car and started kissing me all over my face. "Oh, June, I've missed you so much, baby. I'm so glad you're here. I was afraid you wouldn't come. Let me look at you," he said, holding me at arm's length and then turning me around. "You look wonderful, June. I'm not letting you out of my sight. You're coming home with me, baby. Wait till you see the surprise I have for you, June. You're gonna be so surprised, baby. You're really gonna be." I'd never seen him this excited before, or this handsome. I tried to fight my feelings, remembering Fabian and the reason I was there. "I can't go home with you, Elvis. I don't have any clothes," I blurted out, avoiding the truth. "You don't need anything, baby. We'll buy you a whole new wardrobe when we get home." "But I didn't make plans to go home with you, Elvis." "You don't need plans. The only plans you need are to spend your life with me. We'll call your mother when we get to Memphis. I told Mama you were coming home with me, baby. She can't wait to see you. We have Pat's daddy's car. She can't drive back to Biloxi by herself," I said, still avoiding the issue. "That's no problem, June. One of the boys will drive her home. Wait till you see the surprise I have for you, baby. You're gonna love it." He was holding me in his arms in the middle of his private car and kissing me after every word. I kept thinking about Fabian. I couldn't go home with Elvis. Elvis didn't need me. He had many, many girls to turn to. I was in love with Fabian, and I knew Fabian was in love with me. Fabian needed me. I wouldn't break his heart. I had trusted him with my heart, and I couldn't do that with Elvis. I had to tell him the truth. I just blurted it out. "I can't go with you, Elvis. I'm engaged to be married." "What did you say?" I said, "I'm engaged to be married." His face was blank as he released me and slumped down on the couch. He put his head in his hands for a few seconds, then looked up at me. "You're kidding, June. You can't be serious. You're trying to get even with me, right?" "No, Elvis, I'm not kidding." I looked into his eyes, trying not to cry. He put his head in his hands again. The conductor yelled, "All aboard," and the train gave a slight jerk. Elvis looked up at me with a blank stare. I leaned down and kissed his forehead. "I love you, Elvis Presley. I always will. Take care of yourself." I ran from the car, grabbed Pat's hand, and jumped from the train. My eyes were so full of tears I could barely see. Pat and I walked slowly toward the terminal. As I turned to look back, I saw Elvis leaning out of the door, waving. I waved back and blew him a kiss. I stood there, watching the train as Elvis became smaller and smaller. And then he was gone. The 2-hour ride back to Biloxi was silent. Even the car radio was off. I was so sad. Any song by Elvis would have made me even more upset. The next day, a news story came out in the paper. The headline said, "Elvis buys Graceland." I wondered if this was supposed to be my big surprise. I felt a bit guilty not telling Fabian about my trip to New Orleans to see Elvis one last time. But I thought the less said the better. Talking about Elvis only brought back painful memories. The mention of his name made my heart ache. I knew Elvis wouldn't have just broken my heart. He would have shredded it to pieces. I justified my actions by thinking I was saving myself from the same pain my mother had lived through. I started spending all my time with Fabian. It seemed like every time Pat called, I was busy with something or had plans with my new love. One night when she called, I could hear the resentment in her voice. "So you're home. Are you going to be there for a while? I'd like to come over and show you the new me, if that's okay." "Sure, come on over. I haven't seen you in a while. Fabian's on his way over too. I'll put on a pot of coffee." Fabian and I were sitting in the living room when Pat arrived. She looked amazing. Her hair was a soft ash blonde, and she had a complete makeover. After complimenting her, I offered her coffee. "No, thanks. I'll have a glass of wine if you have any." I was Alma's last customer, and we shared a bottle of wine to celebrate the new me. "I hate to change drinks midstream," she said with a sarcastic laugh. I hoped she wouldn't mention Elvis, but it was the next thing out of her mouth. "Did you tell Fabian about your little trip to New Orleans to see Elvis?" She snapped. "No, Pat, I didn't tell him. Would you like to tell him?" I snapped back. "Well, I think you should be the one to do it. That is, if you're serious about all this marriage stuff." Fabian was holding his mug of coffee, glancing back and forth, waiting for one of us to say something. Pat was glaring at me, ignoring Fabian. I was shocked by her behavior. "Pat, you've had too much to drink. I think you'd better come back some other time." "I haven't had too much to drink. I've only had a few glasses of wine. At least I can think straight, which is more than I can say for you. You don't have time for Fabian, you didn't have time for Elvis, and now you don't have time for me," she yelled, standing up and placing her hands on her hips, daring me to say something. "What's the matter with you, girl? Are you queer for me?" In a flash, she ran toward me, hitting me in the face and knocking me to the floor. I got up, put my arms around her, and tried to pin her arms to her side. I didn't want to hurt her. Fabian took her from me and led her to the door, telling her to go home and sober up. He locked the door, but within seconds she was banging on it and shouting. My nosy next-door neighbor called to tell me to stop the commotion, because he had already called the police. Fabian was outside calming Pat down when the patrol car arrived. He told them everything was under control. As soon as the police drove away, Pat said she wasn't leaving until she talked to me. She sounded calmer, so Fabian brought her back in, but she started screaming and tried to attack me again. Fabian took us both down the street, away from the houses. "Now, if you want to settle this argument like an adult, you'd better do it now. I'm tired of listening to this, and I know June's had enough too," Fabian said to Pat. Pat just stood there, silent, glaring at me with both fists clenched. "Listen, Pat, I don't want to hurt you. I want you to leave me alone. Go home. We'll talk this out tomorrow when you're not so angry. Is that okay with you?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "Fine with me, June, just fine," she said through clenched teeth. Fabian and I started walking back to my house. I had taken only a few steps when Pat jumped on my back, knocking me to the street. My hands and knees were bleeding from the gravel. I pinned her to the ground, pleaded with her to stop, and got up. I couldn't believe this was happening with my best friend. She got up and did it again. My hands and knees were dripping with blood. I lost control and hit her. The sound of my fist on her face made me feel sick. I stepped back, waiting for her to get up, afraid to turn my back. She charged at me again, and I kept knocking her down. It finally ended with Pat on her knees, her face in her hands. I had beaten her bloody. Fabian helped her to her car, but she pushed him away and spat in his face. I cried all the way home. How could this happen? I thought the world of her and she of me. I had even asked her to be my maid of honor. A few days later, Fabian and I were having a sandwich at our favorite cafe when Pat came in. She walked past our table to the ladies' room, stayed a few minutes, then walked by again, leaving the cafe. I pushed my half-eaten sandwich away. If she wanted me to feel guilty, she succeeded. Both her eyes were black and almost swollen shut. Her lower lip was also swollen and purple, with what looked like black stitches hanging out. Knowing I was responsible made it even worse. Pat told our mutual friends that she had driven her car up under the back of a truck and was lucky to be alive. I never told them any different. I wanted to forget it ever happened. As Catholics, Fabian and I wanted to get married in the church. We made appointments to talk to a priest. Our first appointment was on April Fool's Day to get the priest to nullify Fabian's first marriage, which wasn't recognized by the church. The priest was a real hard nut to crack, insisting Fabian patch things up with his ex-wife and practically ignoring me at every visit. If Fabian's civil marriage wasn't recognized by the church, why was it such a big deal? I was puzzled. "Father, forgive me if I sound disrespectful, but Fabian and I will be married on the 1st of June, regardless of who performs the ceremony, you or a justice of the peace," I announced during our final visit, fed up with his double standards and procrastination. I thought this would make him realize we were serious about our June date. But the last week in May arrived, and the priest still hadn't given us his consent to be married in the church. We were married as planned, however, on the 1st day of June 1957. The quiet civil ceremony was held at the home of Fabian's aunt and uncle, with family and a few close friends in attendance. Exactly 24 days after the wedding, Elvis called my house and talked to my mother. Mama called me after she was sure Fabian had left for work. "June, Elvis called here last night." "Elvis Presley?" I asked, shocked. "What other Elvis do you know, June?" she replied, laughing at my response. "What did he say, Mama?" "He wanted you to meet him in New Orleans at Union Station tomorrow at 4 o'clock. I told him I would give you the message. He asked how you were doing, and I told him you were fine, that married life was agreeing with you." He hesitated at first, and then he said, "Oh, she did get married. I told him you got married 3 weeks ago." All he said was, "Oh, I see. Well, it was nice talking to you, Mrs. Juanico. I hope June will be very happy." Then he hung up the phone. He acted surprised, June. "I thought you told him you were getting married." "I did, Mama. I guess he didn't believe me. I wanted to call Pat, but we weren't speaking. I had to talk to someone, though, so I called anyway." Pat answered the phone, and I gave her the information. "Are you going to meet him?" she asked, being polite. "No way, are you kidding? I can't go traipsing all over the country to see Elvis. I'm a married lady now." "Well, I'm going. Thanks for calling, June." Pat, Gail Higgins, and a few other friends from New Orleans went to Union Station to meet Elvis, but he wasn't there. Red West informed the group that Elvis had gotten off the train in Lafayette, Louisiana, rented a car, and driven to Memphis alone. Red didn't give any information as to why Elvis had left the train, and thinking it was none of my business, I didn't ask. Pat told me. "It's my opinion, for what it's worth, that he was afraid you'd be there, or even more afraid you wouldn't be there. You can draw your own conclusions. However, it was a very unusual thing for him to do. I suppose he had his reasons." A few weeks later, Pat stopped by my apartment for a visit. She wasn't overly friendly. She was holding a record in her hand, with a picture of Elvis on the cover. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, handing me the record. The record, just for you, was an extended play album with 4 songs, including Is It So Strange. It had been recorded in January 1957, but wasn't released until after I was married. Pat took the record from my hand and put it on the hi-fi. Listening to the song, I fought back the tears, not wanting Pat to see me cry. But I couldn't help it. I cried anyway. "I'm not going to say I told you so, June. Your big problem was not believing Elvis really loved you. You were too damned busy being afraid he'd break your heart." "What about his heart, June? Did you ever think of that?" she asked, seeming to enjoy my misery. "Did you come here just to see me cry, Pat?" "No, June. I knew you would cry, and I knew I'd see you crying, but that's not the reason I came. I thought you'd like to have your record, that's all. It was recorded just for you. Consider it a gift from a friend," she said on her way out the door. I washed my face, blew my nose, and put ice on my swollen eyes before Fabian came home. I threw myself into making my marriage the perfect one. It was the only way for me to survive. On a warm August day in 1958, I was in the hospital, about to give birth to my first child, Tony. The news of Gladys Love Presley's death had just reached me. The room was filled with a mix of emotions: joy for my new baby and sadness for the loss of someone I cared about deeply. Just 6 weeks later, Pat showed up at my front door, carrying a tiny package wrapped in a blue ribbon. It had been over a year and a half since I last saw her, and the sight of her made my eyes fill with tears. I was holding Tony, my precious new baby, and as I opened the door, we both started crying, hugging each other tightly. After a while, we laughed when Tony made little grunting noises between us. I invited Pat in, handed her the baby, and poured us both a glass of wine. She laughed, asking, "No coffee." I explained that caffeine wasn't good for the baby, and the doctor recommended a beer or a glass of wine daily. We clinked our glasses and talked about the tragic death of Elvis's mother, hoping he was doing okay. I would have gone to the funeral, but Tony was born on August 15th, and I was still recuperating. Thinking about Elvis and the news of Lovey's death actually helped me bear the pain of childbirth. "I did love her, you know," I said, placing Tony in his crib. "I know you did, June. She loved you too," Pat replied. We talked for hours, and Pat brought me up to date on her last visit with Elvis. She and Buddy Conrad had surprised him in Memphis, arriving at 2 in the morning and checking into a motel near Graceland. Buddy called Elvis the next day, and the guard let them through. When they arrived, Elvis greeted them with a big hug, saying, "Gee, it's so good to see you guys. It reminds me of the good old days." I couldn't help but smile at the memory of those days. Pat then told me that Elvis had asked if I had gotten married just to spite him. "What did you tell him, Pat?" I asked, not wanting to know, but unable to resist. I couldn't think of anything to say. I was so shocked. I babbled something, and he said, "Never mind. I don't want to talk about it," and changed the subject. He was upset, June. "I know he still cares," Pat said, shaking her head. "I don't want to talk about it either, Pat. It gets me upset too. I said, taking a deep breath and sipping my wine. Pat changed the subject and told me about her college life. Later, she mentioned that Mrs. Presley had asked about me but sounded angry, thinking I had broken Elvis's heart. When Tony started crying, I changed his diaper and breastfed him, joining Pat in the living room. "Gee, aren't you the perfect mother? I thought they all used bottles these days. I hope he doesn't get drunk from the wine." Pat laughed, surprised to see me breastfeeding. "We have a whittle glass of wine every night, don't we, Witty Bitty?" I said, watching Tony tug hungrily at my breast. Pat handed me the tiny package she had brought. Inside was a small gold band, too big for Tony's tiny thumb. I knew it wouldn't be long before he grew into it. We both knew some things were better left unsaid, and we kept in touch with occasional phone calls and postcards from Pat's travels as a flight attendant. In early 1963, Pat surprised me again, this time with a slightly larger package wrapped in pink ribbon. I was now the proud mother of 2. My beautiful baby girl, Tori, with her big, split pea soup-colored eyes, was born in May 1962. Pat gave me a quick hug, commented on my long hair, and rushed to play with Tori. She handed Tori the package, which contained a sterling silver piggy bank filled with dimes. Tony, now 4.5, woke from his nap and came into the living room. Pat marveled at how much he had grown. "Is this the little baby I held in my arms not too long ago? God, June, he's absolutely gorgeous," she said. "Tony, say hello to Pat. This is the lady who gave you the gold ring you're wearing in your baby picture," I said. Tony smiled shyly, his face turning red. The picture I mentioned showed Tony at 6 months old, wearing nothing but the gold ring. Even though he was lying on his stomach, it was still an embarrassment to him. I had to move it from the living room to my bedroom at his insistence. When I asked Pat if she wanted to see the picture, Tony blocked the entrance to my room. "Maybe some other time," Pat said, seeing the "oh no you don't" look in Tony's eyes. I put on a pot of coffee, and we talked and talked. Pat had recently visited Graceland again, and couldn't wait to share the details. She had an overnight layover in Memphis and called Barbara Rafe, a friend we had met in 1956. Barbara and her husband were planning to attend a small gathering at Graceland that night. Barbara got permission to bring Pat, and Junior Smith welcomed them at the door. Junior was sober for once, and he and Pat caught up on everything going on in Biloxi. "Good old June, she really cooked his goose. Ain't nobody ever said no to the king before," Junior said, laughing. "Well, Junior, I'm sorry it happened the way it did. I thought they were perfect together," Pat replied. "Don't get me wrong, Pat. I'm sorry it happened too. I really liked old June, mainly 'cause she was the kind that wouldn't take no shit. He's still looking for another one like her, but it ain't gonna happen." The mansion was filled with young girls, all dressed to impress. Pat asked Junior about Priscilla, but he said she was with Vernon and his family. Pat was happy to see Elvis finally come down the stairs. He hugged Pat and asked about me and my 2 kids. "How did you know June had 2 kids? I just found out myself recently," Pat asked, surprised. "I've got connections, Pat. Believe me, I've got connections," Elvis said, before excusing himself to talk to others. "Junior, show Pat around the place while I'm gone," Elvis said, and Junior led her through the mansion. The rooms had been redecorated to Elvis's taste, and Pat was particularly interested in his bedroom. She saw a gold telephone and a copy of The Prophet on the nightstand. "It couldn't have been the copy I gave him, Pat. That was a long time ago. It probably got lost," I said, not wanting to get into a debate about Elvis's feelings. "The only thing I think, Pat, is that Elvis likes the book. Nothing more, nothing less. Would you like another cup of coffee?" I asked, changing the subject. Pat followed me to the kitchen and gave me a hug. "I'm sorry, June. I didn't mean to stir up old memories. I won't say anything else, okay? I do have a few more things to tell you, funny things. Nothing that would make you sad, I promise." As we put sugar and cream in our coffee, Pat continued. "Elvis now likes his coffee black and drinks it by the gallon. His cup never gets empty. When I found him to say goodbye, he insisted I stay and brought me back to my hotel later. He introduced me to Bonnie, his date for the evening, and pulled out a chair for me at the kitchen table. Everyone was drinking coffee, and Elvis was hyped up on something. His legs were bouncing so fast you could feel the vibrations through the floor. It was making me so nervous I had to keep my hands off the table. We left the mansion around 4 a.m., and to my surprise, we dropped Bonnie off first. Elvis then called Anita Wood on his car phone. You were right, June. Elvis would never be faithful to one person. Pat never saw Elvis again, but I didn't know it at the time. Later that same year, I would make a trip to Memphis myself and visit my former love. The news that Elvis was in Memphis sent a jolt through me. I couldn't believe it. I thought he was still in Hollywood making movies. My heart was racing as I tried to find the car door handle. The guard, noticing my excitement, laughed and gave us the directions to the theater where Elvis was. He opened the gate, and we drove up to the mansion. As I looked up at the grand house, a mix of happiness and sadness washed over me. I remembered how much Elvis's mother had loved the antebellum homes on the Gulf Coast. She would have been so proud to see this. We decided to go to the theater next. I blotted the tears from my eyes and checked my makeup in the sun visor mirror. I was nervous, thinking about how Elvis would react if he saw me. It had been 6 years since we last met. When we arrived at the theater, the glass doors were locked. I knocked, and a man in the lobby walked over to see who we were. He stared at me for a moment, then smiled. "You're June, aren't you?" he asked. "Yes, I am. How did you know?" "I've seen pictures of you at the mansion. You haven't changed a bit. Does Elvis know you're here?" "No, we just arrived today," I stammered, feeling like a nervous wreck. "I know he'll be glad to see you, June. I'll go tell him you're here," he said, turning to leave. "No, don't do that. I'd rather surprise him if that's okay," I said quickly. The girls waited in the lobby, while the man showed me where Elvis was sitting. The theater was divided into 3 sections, and Elvis was in the center with his date. I walked 1 row behind him and gently tapped him on the shoulder. He turned around, gave me a quick glance, and then did a double take. "June, what in the world are you doing here?" he asked, standing up and hugging me tight. "God, June, you look great. What are you doing here?" he asked again, holding me at arm's length and smiling. I explained that I was with a group of girls, bowling in the national tournament, and had just arrived that afternoon. "Oh," he exclaimed, looking a bit disappointed that he wasn't the main reason for my trip. We were hugging again when Joe Esposito, Elvis's friend, ran over to see what was going on. "Joe, this is June, Wally Taranto's sister-in-law," Elvis said. I had to laugh at the introduction. Wally, my husband's brother, had told me he was close friends with Elvis, but I never believed him. "It's nice to meet you, Joe. Any friend of Wally's is certainly a friend of mine," I said, shaking Joe's hand. "So, this is June Taranto. I've heard a lot about you, June. Nice meeting you at last," Joe said with a grin. "I hate to ask what if you've heard it from Wally." "And not just Wally, June. Elvis has told me lots about you too. Pardon me for interrupting. I thought someone had Elvis in a headlock. I'll leave you two alone. I know you have lots of catching up to do. It was very nice meeting you." Elvis's date was sitting quietly, her eyes fixed on the movie. She must have been annoyed by our interruption, but I didn't know what to say. Elvis started talking again. "How are you, June? Are you happy? How many kids do you have now?" he asked all in one breath. I thought he meant how many were with me in Memphis, and replied, "6. 6? Jesus, June, you don't waste any time, do you? The last I heard, you only had 2. He exclaimed, shaking his head. "You're right, I do have 2 children, a boy and a girl. Someone told me you named your little boy Elvis," he said, looking a bit proud. "You of all people should know better than that. My poor husband takes enough ribbing about you as it is." I didn't think it was true. It would have been a nice compliment, though. At the time, I thought it was probably one of Wally's jokes. "It may have been a compliment, Elvis, but it would also have been grounds for a divorce," I laughed. "Are you doing okay, June? Is there anything I can do for you, baby? You look great, June, really great. You must be happy." "I am, Elvis. I couldn't be happier," I answered, picking up on him calling me baby. "I'm glad, June. I'm happy for you. God, it's been a long time. Let's see. It's been 6 years already. Can you believe it? Funny how time slips away." He hadn't changed a bit. He was still using song titles in his conversation. He invited me and my friends to come to his house the following night, any time after 10 o'clock. I apologized for interrupting his movie, gave him a quick kiss on the mouth, and said goodbye. He stood up, folded his arms across his chest, and watched me walk away. I could feel his eyes on me, still a leg and ass man. He blew me a kiss and gave me an okay sign with his hand, letting me know it was still there and still looking good. As I stepped into the aisle, I heard him muo-ing, his way of saying he saw something he really liked. I turned and blew him a kiss goodbye. The girls were disappointed when I returned to the lobby alone, but they cheered up when I told them we were invited to Graceland the next night. I barely slept that night, replaying our conversation in my head. The next day, our bowling team shared lanes with a team from Detroit. When they learned we were from Biloxi, Mississippi, a few eyebrows were raised. The South was getting a bad reputation for racial tensions, but we were determined to show them true Southern hospitality. We cheered for their team, and they cheered for ours, which helped us both perform better. Both teams finished in the top 20, which was a great achievement in a national tournament. After the tournament, we went back to the motel to get ready for our visit to Graceland. My stomach was in knots, but when we arrived, the guard told us Elvis was having personal problems and couldn't see us. He sent his regrets. My friends were disappointed, but not as much as I was. I had spent extra time on my appearance, hoping to make a good impression. Was he really having personal problems, or was he avoiding me? Either way, his love affair with Anne Margaret was all over the news. Maybe his German girlfriend had had enough and put her foot down. I hoped I was right, only because Elvis's mother was gone and he needed someone to stand up to him. I guess I'll never know. A few months later, Hurricane Camille hit the Gulf Coast. It was the most destructive storm ever recorded. Biloxi and the surrounding cities were devastated. Many lives were lost, and the destruction was massive. The city was cut off from the rest of the world, and it took weeks for emergency crews to restore power and basic services. Fabian, my husband, was worried about his friends and family. He used his fishing skiff to ferry supplies to those in need. Feeling he could help more if he wasn't tied down, he sent me and the children to Las Vegas to stay with his brother Wally. Wally was a casino boss at the International Hotel, where Elvis was performing. The city was filled with billboards promoting Elvis's show, and the crowds were enormous. Wally, without asking, got us tickets to see Elvis's show on my first night in town. The house lights dimmed, and the orchestra played a dramatic version of the theme from 2001, A Space Odyssey. Elvis walked out in a white jumpsuit, looking perfect. He opened with CC Rider and was electrifying. His leg moved so fast, I wondered how his heart could keep up. Some people in the audience whispered that he must be on drugs, but I didn't believe it. He was too smart for that. As Elvis approached our table, fans rushed to the stage, using my back as a step. Wally quickly stepped in to protect me. The show stopped for a moment, while security removed the unruly fans. When we got home, Wally called backstage and got Joe Esposito on the phone. "Is that you, June?" Joe asked. "Yes, it's me. Is Elvis there?" "Hold on, I'll get him for you." "June, is that you, honey?" Elvis asked. "Yes, Elvis, it's me, and don't call me honey." "You haven't changed a bit, have you, baby?" He laughed. "I've changed a little, hopefully for the better. You've changed a little too. I saw your show tonight, and you look better than ever. Your voice is better than ever too, Elvis. I was impressed." "Thanks, June. Coming from you, that makes me feel good. You've been on my mind for the past few days. Did you and your family survive the hurricane okay?" I felt a lump in my throat, thinking about all the devastation back home. But I also felt a warmth in my heart, knowing that Elvis still cared. Elvis's voice was still the same, but his diction had definitely improved. "I'm still just spinning my wheels," he said, but his words were clearer than they were 10 years ago. I was surprised to hear how well he was doing. "I'm fine, Elvis. If things got any better, I couldn't stand it." I replied, using the same line I always used, even when it wasn't entirely true. I wanted to make him feel good. "I've seen a few of your movies, and your acting is improving," I added, though I wasn't being entirely honest. I knew the movies weren't great, but I wanted to support him. "The movies are shit, and you know it, June. I'm still just spinning my wheels," he said, his voice a mix of frustration and exhaustion. "But I'm still trying." I could hear the strain in his voice. "Elvis, you have a beautiful wife and a new baby girl. All you need now is a little boy, and your life will be complete. I said, trying to shift the focus to the positive things in his life. Whoa, June, don't rush me. I'm still trying to get used to being a daddy. Your kids must be getting pretty big now. How old are they? You still have just 2, right? He asked, his voice perking up a bit. Right, Tony is 11 and Tori is 7. They're both beautiful, I replied, feeling a swell of pride. 7 and 11, huh? They would be great at the crap table. Forget I said that, June. My mouth is going 90 to nothing, I'm so hyped up. And I still have another show to do before I can unwind. I noticed how hyper he was, just like on stage. Are you sure you're okay? Is there anything I can do for you? How are you unwinding these days? I asked, genuinely concerned. Don't worry about me, baby. When I need to unwind, I go to bed and read a good book, he said, and I could almost see him smiling. What are you reading? Anything good? I asked, curious. June, you wouldn't believe me if I told you. On second thought, maybe you would. A long time ago, someone very special gave me a book to read. I've read it at least 1,000,000 times, June. It's my favorite book. I try to keep a copy with me at all times. It's my unwinder, he said, and I was so surprised I couldn't think of a thing to say. I knew he was talking about the prophet. Ain't it funny how time slips away? Shit, baby, I didn't mean to go and get sentimental. How's everybody in Biloxi? How's your mother and Mr. Bellman? He asked, his voice softening. They're all fine, Elvis. Everybody's just fine, I answered, only half hearing his question. My mind was still on the book. I see Pat every once in a while, and how's my old friend Buddy Conrad doing? I used to see him all the time, but not lately. He's the joker who told me you named your son Elvis, he said, and I could hear the fondness in his voice. Buddy died a few years ago, Elvis. He had cancer. I told him, my voice heavy with sadness. Damn. Why is it the good die young, June? Why, damn, I sure hate hearing that about good old Buddy. I really liked old Buddy, Elvis said, and there was a long pause. The last few days of his life, all he talked about was you and the good old days. Everything was E.P. This and E.P. that. He was grateful for the time we all had together, he added, his voice thick with emotion. I'm grateful too, June. They were the best years of my life. Listen, baby, I'll be here for another week. So if you need anything, just give me a call. Just ask for Joe. How long are you going to be in Vegas? He asked, trying to change the subject. I'm not sure, Elvis, at least until the power is restored back home. We live in the country, and without power, we have no water, and no air conditioning either, I explained. You live in the country, June. Do you have any horses? He asked, his curiosity piqued. We have 3 horses and 2 cows, but no chickens. You know how I feel about chicken shit, I replied, laughing. You haven't changed a bit, June. I'm real happy for you, baby. You got your ranch after all, he said, his voice warm. It's not really a ranch, Elvis. We call it Oleo Acres, a low-cost spread, I clarified, smiling at the memory of how we came up with the name. That's good, June. Sounds just like you. Are you sure there's nothing I can do for you, baby? He asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. I'm sure, Elvis. Thanks for asking, though. I don't want to keep you on the phone. I know how busy you are. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. Take care of yourself, Elvis. I love you, I said, my heart swelling with emotion. I love you too, June. Take care, baby, he said, and I could hear the sincerity in his voice. We said our goodbyes and the line went dead. The neon lights atop the International Hotel were clearly visible from Wally's front door. I thought of calling him many times during the next 10 days, but I never did. On the way to the airport, I noticed all the billboards with Elvis's name had been taken down. Elvis had left the city. The year 2006 was drawing to a close, and it felt like the world was taking a deep breath before moving on to the next chapter. The air was crisp, and the sky was a canvas of deep blue, hinting at the cold winter nights ahead. For many, this was a time to look back at the year that had passed and to think about what the future might bring. In the small town of Millfield, the streets were quieter than usual. The holiday decorations were up, and the lights twinkled, giving everything a magical glow. Families gathered around their fireplaces, sharing stories and laughter, while outside the snow fell softly, covering the world in a blanket of white. For Sarah, the year had been a roller coaster. She had started high school, made new friends, and faced challenges that she never thought she could overcome. There were times when she felt lost, but she learned that it was okay to ask for help, and that sometimes the people you least expect can become your strongest allies. Her brother, Mark, had his own journey. He was in his senior year, preparing for college, and the pressure was real. But he found his passion in music, and it gave him a sense of purpose. He spent countless hours in the school's music room, composing and playing, and he even started a band with some of his friends. The music brought them closer, and they found that together they could create something beautiful. Their parents, busy with work, found moments to slow down and enjoy the little things. They realized that the best memories were often made in the simplest of moments: a family dinner, a walk in the park, or a quiet night at home. They learned to appreciate each other more, and to communicate better, even when they disagreed. As the year came to an end, the town of Millfield celebrated the holidays with a sense of togetherness. The local church held a candlelit service, and the community center organized a food drive for those in need. Everyone seemed to be a little more generous, a little more understanding, and a little more hopeful. On New Year's Eve, Sarah and Mark sat on the roof of their house, watching the fireworks light up the sky. They talked about the year that had passed, and the one that was about to begin. Sarah felt a mix of excitement and nervousness, wondering what the future held. Mark, with a bit more experience, reminded her that every year brings new opportunities, and that the best way to face them is with courage and an open heart. As the clock struck midnight, the sky was filled with a beautiful display of lights, and the air was filled with the sound of cheers and laughter. It was a moment that felt both fleeting and eternal, a perfect end to a year that had been full of challenges, but also full of growth. The year 2006 was over, but the story was far from finished. For Sarah, Mark, and everyone in Millfield, the future was a blank page ready to be written. And they knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together,